We're going to move to panel two, crime trends. I'm going to be the moderator on this. And this panel was really inspired by an essay published in the Crime Report a couple of months ago, called The Danger of a Return to Crime Alarmism, by four of some of the most prominent criminologists working today: Richard Rosenfeld, Todd Clear, Joe Wallman, and Jim Austin. And I'm going to put up that a link to that right now, so you all have a chance. You can read it. It's a fascinating essay, and it's a kind of a starting point for our discussion today about what the stats actually really mean, what they really tell us, what they don't tell us, and how we can interpret it best, both as journalists and as the informed public. So I want to start off with Professor Rosenfeld, who is, I said, one of the authors of that paper. He is a Curators Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And his research focuses on crime trends and crime control policy. And Rick, welcome back to the Guggenheim. The microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to share screen and bring up my slides. Okay, I hope everyone can see those. Thanks for giving me a few minutes this morning to talk about some of the work I've been doing on tracking crime rates during the pandemic and beyond. I'm going to talk very briefly about changes in 10 different offenses in U.S. cities. We've been tracking offenses during the entirety of the pandemic and somewhat before, through the end of last year, 2021. I'll update people on what we found there. With respect to homicide, I think it's generally known now that homicide rates rose very sharply in 2020. On average, across the cities we looked at, about a 30% increase in 2020 compared with the year before. The increase persisted into last year, according to our data, but at a slower pace. Last year, we estimate that homicides increased about 5% over the previous year. Keep in mind that that previous year, however, was a 30% increase over 2019. Needless to say, well, it may not be needless to say, it's important to say that even with this increase, the homicide rate is far from the peak rate we saw in the early to mid 1990s, and Al Blumstein will have more to say about that. And I want to then go on to talk about how other crimes, which constitute the majority of street crimes, continued to fall last year. I'll deal with some of the explanations for the changes we've seen. I'll engage in a highly uncertain prediction exercise, give us some sense of how we might think about crime rate changes in the near future. And then I'll talk about the policy challenge. Your former panel did a wonderful job, I thought, on that issue. So let's look at the crime changes from 2020 through the end of last year. As I mentioned, homicide rates up 5%. We estimate aggravated assaults up 4%. Gun assaults and domestic violence up 8% and 4%. Robberies up 1%. And then, as you can see, the property crimes, with an important exception, continued to go down. Burglaries down 6%, larcenies down just 1%, motor vehicle theft up 14%. And we can talk about why, some of the reasons why you might see that departure from the trend in other property crimes. Drug offenses down 12%. And as I note here, the gun assault and domestic violence data are based on just 12 cities for which we could get the data we needed. So those figures have to be viewed with some caution. Here's the homicide rate from January 2018 through the end of last year. You see the peak during the summer of 2020. You also see the cyclical change that happens over time. And then into 2021, there's another summertime peak, as we would expect, but somewhat lower than the peak during the previous year. Here are 22 cities for which we could obtain homicide data for 20 and 21. And as you can see, there's great variability, even though on average the change was just 5% above the previous year. So in Austin, for example, St. Petersburg, we see continuing and very large increases, sizable increases in Norfolk, Washington, LA, Louisville, Philadelphia, and then quite modest increases in Denver, Atlanta, Buffalo, Raleigh, Milwaukee, Chicago, Memphis. Many of those cities had seen sizable increases the year before. And then there are quite a few cities in which we saw declines. Notable perhaps is the 25% decline in homicide in Seattle. So while the average change in homicide was a 5% increase, as you can see, there was really some variability across cities. Where are these increases occurring in our cities? The increases, according to everything I've been able to determine, they're concentrated in communities that have had chronically high levels of firearm violence tied to racial disparities, racial segregation, poverty, underemployment, if you will, the usual suspects that accompany high levels of firearm violence. The increase is concentrated among young men who live in those high-risk communities. And there's little evidence that firearm violence is spreading to other communities, other areas, or other population groups. Explanations. They're neither exhaustive nor mutually exclusive, nor I should add definitive. But I think there are 6 major explanations for the changes we've been seeing over the last couple of years. One clearly is the change in routine day-to-day activities that associated with the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, which in my view drove property crime rates down and had rather complex impacts on violent crime. The change in routine activities took more people off the street, reducing opportunities for many kinds of contact crimes. But as people remained in their homes, that provided perhaps greater opportunities for domestic violence. And so the impact of the change in routine activities was really different according to crime type. During the period of social unrest that emerged after the George Floyd murder in late May of 2020, many police officers were taken off their normal patrol routines out in the neighborhoods and redeployed to deal with protest activities in nearly every city in the country. And that could have contributed to some crime increase in the neighborhoods. In addition, COVID impacted policing quite substantially. Many officers were out on quarantine. Those who remained on the job subject to social distancing requirements or their own discretion to maintain distance between people they encountered on the street. That pullback too could have contributed to the increase in homicide and perhaps other violence. As I'll show in a moment, there's good evidence nationwide for plummeting decline in the confidence on the part of African Americans in police, and that could have contributed to crime increases as people were less willing to cooperate with the police, report instances to the police, and so on. As I think is generally known, firearm sales during the pandemic increased very sharply. More guns were making their way onto the streets, and that could certainly have contributed to the increase we saw in firearm violence generally, homicide in particular. The drug markets, the opioid markets, methamphetamine markets, they expanded during the pandemic. And I've done work with Joel Wallman and other colleagues showing that in those US counties with higher or increasing rates of drug overdose deaths, we see higher or increasing rates of homicide. So I wouldn't discount the role of drug markets in the recent increase we've seen in homicide. Then there's the stress and strain, not to mention the dislocations associated with the pandemic that could well have generated increases in violence. Those are 6. There may be others. They're not mutually exclusive. And as I said earlier, they're not definitive, but these are the areas I think we should be digging into more deeply as we're looking for explanations for what's happened recently. I mentioned that confidence in the police plummeted in 2020. You can see that here. Confidence in the police on the part of white adults, according to Gallup polling, has been relatively stable over the last couple of decades. And was stable on the part of Black adults, even though Black adults register lower levels of confidence than whites do, until we got to the Ferguson instance in late 2014, and you see a 6-point drop in confidence on the part of Black adults. And then when we get to the Floyd murder in Minneapolis, there's an 11-point drop. However, much of that recent drop has been recovered last year, bringing confidence among Black adults back to where it was, roughly speaking, in 2014, 2019. And that's quite a bit lower than where it was years before that. So confidence in the police on the part of African Americans nationwide took a big drop after Ferguson and an even bigger drop after the Floyd murder. Criminologists are often asked, what's going to happen to crime rates in the near future? And predictions are always hazardous, no matter what one is trying to predict, especially during times of heightened uncertainty. So, should we expect crime rates to return to pre-pandemic levels? What about rising inflation? How will that at all contribute to crime increases? Those are the kinds of questions many criminologists have been getting. And we have to answer those questions in the midst of an important exogenous shock to crime trends, especially homicide, which had been changing more or less predictably for perhaps 3 decades, only to increase rather precipitously, homicide in particular, in 2020. An exogenous shock is an event that occurs that was not predicted, not anticipated, perhaps in many ways not predictable, and brings a shock to the system of changes in crime that, as you'll see in a moment, had been more or less expected up until the year 2020. So let me give an illustration of how these kinds of shocks affect crime predictions, and in particular, the pandemic. So let's ask the question, what will happen to the homicide rate by the end of this year and the following year. I developed a model with colleagues that is really quite simple. It's based on, we're trying to now figure out what's the current homicide rate, and the best fitting model and the most parsimonious model uses last year's homicide rate, last year's change in inflation, and last year's imprisonment rate as predictors of the current homicide rate. And as you'll see in a moment, the predicted rates come quite close to the observed rates, the actual rates, until 2020. The model predicted a homicide rate of 5.6 homicides per 100,000 population. The observed rate was 6.5, quite a bit higher. And so I developed 3 model-based estimates of homicide rates in 2021, that is the end of last year, as well as 22 and 23. The high estimate treats 2020 like any other year. And the effect of that, as you'll see, is to bake in that big increase we saw in 20 into the estimates for subsequent years. The low estimate assumes that 2020 was an anomaly and uses the 2015 to 2019 5-year average rate of change in homicide to estimate the future changes, that is, using pre-pandemic changes, recent ones, to predict 2022 and 23. And then I produce a middle estimate that's midpoint between those high and low estimates. So here's the result of the model. In blue are the predicted homicide rates over time from 80 through 2020. In red are the observed rates. And by and large, the 2 series correspond rather closely. We see a somewhat higher jump in homicide in the late 80s and 1990 in the observed rate of homicide compared to the prediction. That was the period of the crack era and drug market violence driving up homicide rates in a way that is not captured in our model. But then we get to 2020 and we see that divergence I mentioned. So how does that divergence affect our ability to use the model to predict future changes? What you see here is that high estimate, which bakes in the change occurring in 2020, would bring us to a homicide rate in 2023 that we haven't seen since the mid-90s. Excuse me, the low estimate would essentially keep us at a homicide rate that we experienced in 2020, not change it very much, and the mid estimate is somewhere in between. Now, I think that high estimate is implausibly high, but it all depends on how one decides to treat what happened in 2020 and to a lesser degree 2021. Was it an anomaly that will quickly disappear from crime trends, or was it a change that will be with us for at least the near future? That's the uncertainty. So when in the midst of that kind of uncertainty, it's very, very difficult to predict crime rate changes. Homicide is the worst case. The high and low predictions for property crimes, for example, are very similar to one another. But even if we use the pre-pandemic homicide trend to predict future changes, we do not expect to see a decrease in homicide. Inflation rates are expected to remain high. Imprisonment rates are expected to continue to fall. And we have to add all this then to the uncertainty that we will have trying to figure out what happened in 2021 as the FBI transitions to NIBRs from Uniform Crime Reports, at an agency participation rate of in the low 60% range, meaning that we'll already have questions about the reliability of the FBI's 2021 crime estimates, in addition to the uncertainty brought about by the exogenous shocks. I'm going to leave it there, Steve, and not talk about recommendations. I think I'm happy to talk about my own as we move forward, but I think your previous panel and certainly subsequent ones are going to deal with this issue in great detail. Let me stop there and bring it back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Rick. We'll get back to it if you have some time in the discussion as well. And just to note that we will post your report, your PowerPoint on our website. I already sent around the link earlier. So anybody who's worried about getting a copy of it will have that available for you certainly later on today, if not tonight. Let me move immediately to Professor Blumstein. Alfred Blumstein is the J. Erik Jonsson University Professor of Urban Systems and Operations Research at Carnegie Mellon. He's a past president of the American Society of Criminologists, as also, of course, is Rick. And needless to say, he's one of the country's most renowned criminal justice scholars. He is a standby in all of our Guggenheim symposia, and in a moment you'll see why. Professor Blumstein, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. What I'd like to talk about is some issues in the criminal justice system, particularly following the information Rick gave you about the rise in homicide. I want to talk about crime and the crime trends, where they are now and what they've come from, in contrast to Rick talking about where they're going. At least I can rely on some interesting data, and we'll see where that goes. I also want to say something about the mass incarceration that we've experienced and are doing things about it, and some interesting changes that came up during the pandemic. And I also want to say something about an issue of increasing concern and increasing attention within the criminal justice system, and that's the issue of racial disproportionality. And we've made, I think, quite a bit of progress in that regard, and hope that continues and see what we could do about keeping it going. And the racial disproportionality is an issue of considerable concern, and there's been important progress to date, and there are lots of opportunities for improving the criminal justice system's race biases. Would you go to chart number 5, which is a graph, the first graph I have. Chart number 5, please. Next, there it is. No, come back. Come back. Okay, this is just a graph of what Rick was talking about, except I'm looking back 10 years to 2010. We see murder and robbery. Murder is in red, of course, and robbery in green. But I divided robbery by 25 so that it comes on a similar scale as murder. And what you see is the numbers that Rick talked about, under a total of 10 per 100,000, but starting out there at about 5 or 6. They're very close. They were very close back in the early part of that last decade. And we started to see, even before the pandemic started, we started to see a divergence with robbery coming down and murder going up. And you see the very large rise from 19 to 20. That was a 30% rise. and then about a 7% rise through 21. We don't yet have the robbery numbers for them, but I think you'll find it interesting. And that increase of 30%, which is what really captured the headlines, and of course, you know, if it bleeds, it leads in the press, so that the 30% captured lots of concern. It raised lots of political concern about crime in the streets. It involved a departure from looking at rational factors that are contributing, but so we've got to do something about this horrible increase in homicide. And let's go to the next slide. What I've tried to do here is give a longer-term view of those two crimes, because murder represents the prime person crime, and robbery represents a prime property crime. And look how close they had been tracking each other on the scale of about 10, which was the peak that was ever reached, about 10 or so, starting from a fairly low rate in 1960 into the 70s, and the drug war and the incarceration of older people. And in 1985, the recruitment of young people into the drug markets as replacements for the very large incarceration, the very large interruption. And the problem there was that young people did not, if you were in the drug market, you better carry guns to protect yourself against people who are going to rob you of the drugs or the money that you got from selling them. So you better have a gun. And it's well known that young people are nowhere as careful, as thoughtful about the effects of their using that gun than older people. And so you saw a major increase in homicide, and the increase was largely driven by young people and young people dragged into those drug markets, particularly the crack markets that were very heavily involved in the drug trade and also in the violence associated with those drug markets. And then starting in 1993 or thereabouts, at that peak, you saw the major 45% drop from 1993 to 2000. 1994, interestingly, was the year that the 94 crime bill was passed to provide for much greater incarceration, with the federal government providing incentives to the states to keep people in prison. In any event, we saw that, and it took a number of years for that incarceration capacity to build up, but we saw that major drop in drug markets, in part because the word was going out about some of the ill effects of the drug market. So there was a major drop in demand. And so the drug effects contributed to that 45% drop to the start of the current century, to 2000. And from then it went pretty flat, largely down slightly, nothing like that big drop. And then starting in about 2015, we started to see the divergence that was shown in the previous graph, that divergence between the between the robbery rates, which continued to decline, and the homicide rates, which started up. Certainly, we know a major factor was the availability of guns, and the 6 other factors that Rick mentioned are also involved in one way or another, but certainly a real presence in the environment was the presence of guns. And that last upward spike in from 2019 to 2020 represents that big 30% increase. Now, in the context of these rates that were much higher previously, around 10 per 100,000, that went from about 5.1 to about 6.5. And if you count the 7% estimate for 20 to 21, that's a less steep increase, but another increase. But that took it from 6.5 to about 7. But recognize that that homicide increase is far below the level of 10 per 100,000 that prevailed in the 80s and 90s, and especially in the early 90s when we started that decline that Joel Wallman and I put together a book called The Crime Drop in America. Let's go back a couple of slides to slide number 5 about the current crime problem. That's it. Come back. That's it. I just wanted to provide some of this in detail. That was a very large percentage change, but that previous peak was about 10, and the recent peaks were well below 10, and they were a homicide rate of about 7. So it's important to recognize that there was a rise, but any increase in homicide particularly a percentage increase, is going to attract a lot more political attention. And I think the attention to it is warranted, but it's certainly an issue that warrants a lot of concern about not overstating the problem and not getting frantic about it, because we are much better able to deal with a larger issue, and we will find ways to deal with the recent increase. I think the fact that the two have been so closely linked is an important recognition that crimes tend to follow each other in many ways, depending on the environment, the political situation in the country. And my hunch is that if 2022 is what we might call the new normal in the general environment with respect to dealing with the pandemic, we may even revert to a new normal, which will be a lower murder rate, less robbery, and we might well see some changes. And I think Rick's projections were particularly interesting in terms of looking at where things might go in the future. Next slide, please. I really want to say something about incarceration rate, because so much of that was a response to the increase in violence from the 70s to the early 90s. And that took us to an incarceration rate of 500 per 100,000, which was the highest incarceration in the world. And it followed a half century with a very stable rate of incarceration of 110 per 100,000 from 1920 to 1970. Let's take a quick look at the next slide. this is the graph of the US incarceration rate from 1925 to 2019. And we see that impressively flat rate with somewhat of a rise during the Depression, somewhat of a decline following that, and a dip down in the period when we were in the Vietnam War, when we needed more young men to fight. And then we saw that frenetic rise in incarceration that peaked in 1909. Let's come back to the previous slide. There was essentially no response to that 45% drop in violence. We kept that high incarceration going until 2005, until 2009. And the drop was largely associated with the declining demand for drugs, the declining rate of violence, because they no longer needed those kids in the drug market. But we were in a reasonably rich job market. So there was opportunities in the job market for the kids who were being dropped out of the job market, out of the drug market. And the federal crime bill, interestingly, was passed before the 1993 UCR, Uniform Crime Reports by the FBI, even arrived in the end of 1994. So the violence declined, continued to decline since 2000, but it was at a much slower rate of decline. After 2009, there was a recognition that we were into this period of mass incarceration, and states started to bring incarceration rates down, partly because of the cost, partly because they were digging more deeply into offenses and unreasonably filling the prisons. And so there were lots of opportunities to bring it back down, and that was certainly fortunate. The largest prison population during that period was that associated with drugs, and drugs still constitute a very large part of prison population, even though we've seen a legalization of some drugs and a recognition that treatment was much more appropriate, much more effective than incarceration as a means of dealing with that drug problem. Let's move on to say something about the COVID decline contributed to greater declines. If we can move further, I just wanted to say something about the degree to which, past that, and past that. Please, next slide. There we go. There was a recognition in the correction system that, gee, the density of people in the prisons always exceeded the capacity. And in the presence of a highly infectious disease, it was important that they reduce prison populations and introduce, and so much of that disease was being spread to the staff, so there were lowered staff. So there was some need to decline, and jail populations in 2020 declined by 25%, and the prisons declined by 15%. And obviously, jails have much more rapid turnover, providing room for responding to the increased need for people awaiting trial who represent typically the majority population in the jails, and people in prison have fixed terms and especially life terms. And so it was easier for the jails to do the decline much more slowly in terms of the prisons because of the legal demand of people serving the sentence. And an important part of that was the growing number of people who are there on life terms. And interestingly, ironically, the prisoners who were with life terms are typically much older and of much lower risk to public safety, and could have been, if they could put them back in the community and provide for the currently active younger people, that would have been much more effective in terms of public safety. The president and the prisoners released since 2009, looking at the previous chart that you saw, that peak was 2009, and we've seen a 25% decline in state prisoners released, and that's been a reduction of the widespread desire to lower the cost, the widespread punitiveness, and the limited effectiveness of incarceration. I want to say something briefly about the next slide, which is the issue of racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system, which is an issue of major concern. I think it's clear that there has been major progress in recent years in reducing the racial disproportionality in prisons. When you look at the race differences between, say, 1990 and today, the incarceration rates are much less in terms of the ratio of Black incarceration rates to white incarceration rates. Unfortunately, those per capita rates, that is, prisoners per capita, per general population, include the combined effects of the racial differences in treatment by the criminal justice system, which is what we would like to get rid of, and racial differences in the involvement in the crime, which is a legitimate basis for seeing racial differences if there are racial differences in the participation. And differences in arrest are usually taken as the indicator of their differential involvement. But again, those differences, those arrest rates are subject to bias based on where police patrol. They're more heavily located in the minority neighborhoods where there has been more crime, and so they are more likely to arrest for a variety of other issues like stop and frisk, and so there's an effect of location that shows up in the differences, and as well as any police racial bias. Next slide. One aspect of the arrest as the indicator is the concern for measurement of violent crimes, because there are certainly differences by race in the arrest for violent crime, and there are now two different and independent sources for measuring arrests. The traditional one is based on who police arrest, but the other is the report of the National Crime Victim Survey, NCVS, run by the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the Justice Department. and it's the report of the violence victims in the perpetrator's race. Victims of violent crimes are there to report the race of the victim, and that they're the victims, so they saw the perpetrator of the violent crime, whereas the victim of a property crime is not likely to have seen the perpetrator, so that we have these two independent sources. And these two sources, in a recent paper that Alan Beck and I did, have been found to be strikingly consistent in the measurement of racial differences in perpetrating these violent crimes. And so there are still vulnerable to racial bias associated with police locations and personal bias for other crimes, but this is mostly a problem with drug arrests, where arrest differences are much more influential much more influenced by the presence of police in the high density neighborhoods, the stop and frisk strategies. And so these are opportunities for getting beyond the racial bias issues. And so that the next slide shows that the arrests for violent crimes are mostly free from racial bias, and provides an opportunity to see the effect of location differences that might be translated to other crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al. We'll hold the questions. We have some questions waiting in our Q&A box. We'll wait till all our panelists are finished, then go to them. Again, please put your questions in the Q&A window, and we'll get to them in due time. Let me move to our third speaker, Julia Schleimer. Julia is a research data analyst at the University of California, Davis, in their violence prevention research program. And she and her team have done some excellent reports over the past year on various aspects of gun violence in particular. And Julia studies the causes, consequences, and prevention of violence. And she has been associated with two really excellent reports, which I hope she'll speak about now. One is the, as she calls it, the social conditions in crime during the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact of compassionate release, or the non-impact of compassionate release. And the second one is on unemployment and crime in U.S. cities during the coronavirus epidemic. I'm sorry, I correct. The compassionate release is our next panelist, our next panel. So ignore what I just said. So Julia, I'm going to go over to you right now, and you have the mic. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Does that look all right? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, yes. Great. So yeah, thank you again so much for the introduction and the invitation to be here today. It's really my great pleasure to be here, especially with Professors Blumstein and Rosenfeld, just giants in this field. So today I'm going to talk about social conditions and crime during the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, with a particular focus on violence and violent crime. So over 30 years ago, Dr. David Satcher, former Surgeon General and director of the CDC, said of violence, "If it's not a public health problem, why are all those people dying from it?" And Dr. Satcher has been instrumental in framing violence as a public health issue. And that's really where I want to focus today. From a public health perspective, there are different ways that we can intervene to improve population health. And this health impact pyramid, developed by Dr. Tom Frieden, depicts different types of public health interventions, which in descending order produce the largest public health impact, and in ascending order require increasing individual effort and individualized intervention. And of course, these levels, all of these levels are important, and there's crossover between them. But as shown here, public health interventions which address socioeconomic factors or social determinants of health more broadly, the base of the pyramid, may have the greatest population impact. And this is true for many different health outcomes, including violence. And so, as was mentioned, I'm going to share results from two recent papers that my team and I worked on. And the first listed here is entitled Neighborhood, Racial, and Economic Segregation and Disparities in Violence During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So first, just a little bit about why we wanted to quantify place-based racial and economic disparities in violence. So first, it's one way of bearing witness to the lived experience of communities that are most heavily impacted by violence. Second, it can provide some context for understanding what drives crime and whether current interventions are working. Third, it is critical to guide equitable prevention and response measures, including resource allocation and investment. So our research questions for this particular study were twofold. First, we wanted to estimate the magnitude of place-based disparities in violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. So how big were these disparities? Second, we wanted to know whether pandemic era disparities were different from pre-existing disparities that have existed prior to the pandemic. And for this analysis, we focused on 13 major US cities that made zip code level data on crime publicly available. And we focused on the early part of the pandemic, the period from March through July 2020. And we examined the relationship between zip code privilege or disadvantage along this spectrum and violence. And so we defined zip code privilege and disadvantage by comparing the population of low-income Black households to high-income white households in each zip code, such that the most privileged zip codes had greater concentrations of high-income white residents, and the least privileged zip codes had greater concentrations of low-income Black residents. And importantly, I want to highlight here that we recognize race as a social construct, which reflects exposure to racism. And in terms of outcomes, we examined 5. First, firearm violence. Second, homicide. Third, aggravated assault. Fourth, robbery. And fifth, rape. And firearm violence here includes both fatal and non-fatal interpersonal firearm violence. And we found that during the first 5 months of the pandemic, from March through July 2020, compared with the most privileged zip codes, the least privileged zip codes experienced an average of 14 more incidents of firearm violence, almost 150 more aggravated assaults, 5 more homicides, 49 more robberies, and 6 more rapes per zip code on average. And after accounting for pre-existing disparities from 2018 and 2019, the difference between less and more privileged zip codes shrank, but it was still generally meaningful. So compared with the most privileged zip codes, the least privileged zip codes experienced an average of 2.3 more incidents of firearm violence, 23 more aggravated assaults, and 1 more homicide, but 7.4 fewer robberies and 2.2 fewer rapes per zip code on average, again, during this 5-month period of the pandemic. And now I'm going to shift to talking about the second study that we did, which is on unemployment and crime in US cities, again, during the coronavirus pandemic. So first, a little background on why we were interested in unemployment. So cross-sectionally, at least, economic conditions, including poverty, income inequality, and unemployment, are strong predictors of crime. Second, unemployment surged during the first months of the pandemic, and many people, both in academia and the popular press, hypothesized a link between the concurrent rise in violence. And third, better understanding this unemployment-crime relationship can help inform prevention strategies that focus on modifiable economic conditions. So for this study, we were primarily interested in estimating whether the acute increase in unemployment during the pandemic was associated with changes in crime rates among 16 major US cities. And here we focused on violent crimes, including firearm violence, homicide, and aggravated assault, as well as primarily acquisitive or acquisition-based crimes, including burglary, larceny theft, motor vehicle theft, and robbery. To remind us of the context, this figure shows the percentage of the population in 16 US cities that were unemployed in each month from January 2018 through July 2020. And we can see that beginning in March 2020, there was an unprecedented rise in unemployment. And importantly, evidence suggests that the economic fallout of the pandemic disproportionately affected communities that already experience greater financial vulnerability, therefore contributing both to increases in
there'll be
absolute,
questions.
Yeah,
There'll be a
but you'll be
discussion.
fine with the question.
Oh, yeah.
absolute economic hardship and inequality. And we focus specifically on this 5-month period from March through July 2020 and honed in on the highest and the lowest levels of unemployment in each of those cities during that 5-month period. And we then asked, what is our best guess of how crime would have been different had peak unemployment levels in all cities been sustained for the entire 5-month period, March through July, compared with what we actually observed in terms of unemployment in each city in each month. And this provides a probable worst case scenario in terms of controlling pandemic-related unemployment. And in this scenario, we estimated that there may have been an associated increase of 3.3 more firearm violence incidents and 2 more homicides on average per city in each month during this 5-month period. And then we asked, what is our best guess of how crime would have differed had the lowest unemployment levels in all cities been sustained for that entire 5-month period, March through July 2020, compared with actual unemployment in each month. And this provides, again, a probable best case scenario in terms of controlling pandemic-related unemployment, since it's unlikely that there could have been 0 increase in unemployment. And we estimated that this scenario might have been associated with 8.4 fewer firearm violence incidents and 4.5 fewer homicides on average per city in each month during this period. And neither scenario, either this worst case or best case scenario, was associated with changes in aggravated assault or primarily acquisitive crimes, including burglary, larceny theft, motor vehicle theft, and robbery. So I'm just going to highlight some key findings from these 2 studies. First, marginalized communities endure endemically high levels of violence, including before the pandemic. However, disparities in certain types of violence, the types that increased overall during the pandemic, only worsened in early 2020. And in addition, we found that the sharp increase in unemployment during the pandemic may have been associated with an increase in firearm violence and homicide. And homicides are mostly firearm involved in the US, but not other crime. And just a couple of notes on implications in future research. So these results have several implications. First, they suggest a need for explicit recognition of context, both historical and contemporary, that contribute to lasting inequities in crime and violence. Second, and importantly, they suggest a need for investment in strategies that target the same social and structural conditions that give rise to these inequities, including anti-racist programs and policies that address economic inequality. Third, we need to continuously and rigorously evaluate the potential impact of these types of interventions, which address social and structural conditions. And I just want to end with a few acknowledgements of my team and our funders, and also my contact information is listed there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Again, we will post both of those reports on our website. I want to move to questions now, but before I do, I just want to make a quick point. What Professor Rosenfeld was talking about the studies that he produced came out as a result of the Council on Criminal Justice work. So I wanted to make sure there was a shout out for them. And again, his report is on our site and posted there, as well as on the Council on Criminal Justice. So let me move to the questions. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're very interesting, very absorbing. So I don't know how much we can actually get through, but and I'll try to bring as much together, as many together as I can. Just starting with the first one. Recently, the DOJ launched a new firearms trafficking task force to disrupt access to firearms in some of the cities that are seeing violent crime spikes. And Sarah Lynch is wondering if any of you think this new initiative will be effective in reducing crime in these communities. So I don't know who wants to respond to that, but whoever is, be my guest.
Well, I'll just say I simply don't know. I'm not at all certain how effective those strategies are going to be. It is the case that the firearm used in crimes on the street in cities in the Northeast in particular come up through the so-called iron pipeline. And if the iron pipeline can be shut down, that certainly would reduce the number of firearms available to people on the street in the big cities. But that's a big, big if. So my sense is we're going to have to find out. But I don't have any a priori expectations about the effectiveness of those strategies.
Here's an interesting question from George Joseph of the City, who's wondering whether anyone found that access to the pandemic stimulus payments offset or failed to offset the potential effects of spikes in unemployment. So Julia, maybe that's something that you might want to answer. Maybe followed by Rick.
Absolutely. So I think this is a really important question, and it's something that we didn't look at in our research. We really focused on unemployment alone without any potential buffering effects of any of the economic stimulus or other interventions. But I think that's a really critical next step for research to understand, in an applied way, what can we do practically that will help combat increases in unemployment and their potential consequences.
And of course, we know those stimulus payments are easing off. So
right.
The converse is that will we see any rise in crime or any impact on crime with a loss in those payments? Does anyone else want to weigh in on that, Richard or Al?
Yeah, just very briefly, the stimulus payments put more money in people's pockets on the street, and that would lead to the expectation that robbery rates would go up, and yet robbery rates were coming down. And as the stimulus payments have trailed off in recent months, we see robbery rates now again rising. So at least by that indicator, it's not clear to me that the stimulus payments had a great deal to do with the crime changes that we saw.
It's awful tough to attribute any single treatment to changing crime, in large part because there are so many combining factors that end up overwhelming any single treatment. So it is certainly a complex phenomenon, and there are many approaches to reducing violence, and they all have some effect or claim some effect. But sorting it all out, thinking there is a single solution is certainly not a way to anticipate the changes that one would like to impose.
Here's maybe a harder question, which would probably take a book to explain, but George Joseph again wants to know what effect inflation may have on crime. So we really have no idea at this point whether the inflation we're seeing now is temporary or endemic, but who wants to weigh in on that?
Well, I've done actually quite a bit of research on the impact of inflation on crime rates. I did see that question in the chat box. And the one questioner wanted to know, well, what's the theory behind the impact of inflation on crime? Inflation drives up prices by definition. And people in that context begin to trade down, to use the economist term. So if they've been shopping in the mid-levels of the retail market, they may now do more of their shopping at Walmart or other discount stores. If that's where they've been doing their shopping, they may trade down to the Goodwill and Salvation Army outlets. But people at that level of the retail market will drop down. They might check backyard sales, or they'll check the market for stolen goods. The cardinal attribute of a stolen good is that it's cheaper than the equivalent good that one would purchase in the formal retail market. And so demand for stolen goods tends to increase as overall prices increase, and that generates, in the first instance, increases in so-called acquisitive crimes. But it also, the research shows, generates increases in violent crime, including homicide. So in a nutshell, that's the theory. I think we're about to see whether inflation, the abrupt increase in inflation, is going to generate increases in crime. I will note in our own research that through the end of last year, robbery rates that had been coming down flattened out and began going up slightly. The decrease in larceny basically ended and flattened out. And we'll have another report issued by the Council on Criminal Justice after the end of the first quarter of this year. And we're going to look specifically at inflation impacts on crime rate changes.
So we've seen a lot of stories in the past month or so about the I guess, so-called wilding, where you've got bunches of kids running into stores, grabbing goods off the counter, and then leaving. In San Francisco, in other cities around the country. Does this represent anything, or is it? I mean, is it being overdone by the media? It's a wonderful media story, but does it say anything to you about the nature of crime, youth crime, inflation, the economy, anything like that? Or is it just one of those stories we love to do every once in a while in the media?
That's an important point. These are anecdotal accounts. Don't know about any systematic changes. But to the degree that they're at all reliable, I think it's possible the perception is out there that for a variety of reasons, these kinds of crimes, low-level larceny, shoplifting, may not attract the kind of police attention that they once did for a variety of reasons, one of which is the police are more focused on more serious violent crime. So people are acting with a sense of impunity to a greater degree, perhaps. The same has been said about anecdotal accounts about the uptick in carjackings, especially by very young people. Don't know whether that's a systematic across the board phenomenon or just happened to have attracted the attention of a few reporters in a few places. But I wouldn't discount the overall increase in prices as a reason for why we may be seeing thefts from retail stores go up.
Mm-hmm. Let me go on to, there's a lot of material here really that's really worth getting into, but we were talking about the model, the relationship with the imprisonment rate, the incarceration rate to predicting future homicide rates. And there are two questions related to that in our question bank. One is to explain why the imprisonment rate, and incarceration is a factor. Does an increase in the rate increase or decrease the predicted rate of homicides? And is there any statistical evidence of by how much? Al, that might be something you wanna go after.
It's awful tough to sort out trends in incarceration rate for trends in any crime, in part because such a small fraction of the people who might do the crime are there in the prison. And there's so much going on in terms of the multiple explanations for changes in crime rate. The one that I like best is the widespread availability of guns, because homicides attempted with choking or with knives have a large error in who gets murdered and who doesn't. Whereas with the guns, especially the guns that we see out in the street increasingly, have a high probability of being certain to kill the person who's aimed at. And much more often they're aimed at somebody who is very secondary. And there are lots of people who might be looking to do the crimes. So Rick had 6 explanations for some of the changes that he talked about. And I'm sure there are many more associated with the socioeconomic environment that drives people into personal or economic forces.
If I could just add, Steve, why would one put the imprisonment rate in a model of crime trends? Well, the thought is, as Al pointed out, that, people who are in prison are not a random draw from the population. They are people who have committed crimes, often at high frequency. By taking them out of the population for a period of time, that could have an immediate impact on crime. But as Al points out, it can't just be that. And so the thought is that as imprisonment rates go up, people perceive that the risks of committing crime increase and they are less likely to commit crime. Now, I put the imprisonment rate in the model only because it's one of the few variables that has this continuous, robust effect on crime. And I should point out that it's very, very difficult to separate the impact of imprisonment from the impact of changes in the jail population, changes in the parole population, and indeed changes in the probation population. They're all very, very highly correlated. They change at about the same rate over time. So it could well be that what I'm mistakenly attributing to imprisonment could actually be a function of some of these other components of the correctional system.
Steve, you're muted.
You're muted, Steve.
What about gang activity? That's a question that has arisen in our box, but also whether it hasn't been really talked about by you guys in terms of a factor, particularly in urban areas. Do you see any of that? I guess it's also related to the access to guns.
Gang activity has always been an important part of an important part of homicide. With members of a gang getting back at members of another gang. And that has continued to be an important issue. And as gangs were involved in drug trade, that brought the gangs together again in a variety of ways. So that's certainly been important. And I don't know that those have been seen to be significantly reduced in any recent years.
Julie, do you want to take on the question of the interrelationship of guns and access to guns and crime rates and unemployment rates and all that? I mean, there's so many different intersecting webs that we can talk about here, but the gun issue and the gun violence issues in your wheelhouse in particular at UC Davis.
Yeah, absolutely. So
and I'm sorry if I can just add on, Cassie Chu just asked an add-on to that question is whether we have any insights on whether the record numbers of firearm sales since March 2020 has impacted the levels of crime, which is a much sharper question, actually.
Right, absolutely. So as Al said, firearms are incredibly lethal. And so if a firearm is involved, the probability of a death occurring is much higher. And so there's a real important need to focus on the instrument of violence, particularly firearms. And the availability of firearms interacts with tons of other things in the environment. So again, as others have said here, it's really a number of things coming together to increase firearm violence in particular. So the increase, or just pre-pandemic levels of gun access were high as well, but also there was an increase. And so that coming together with all of the other things during the pandemic, stress, financial instability, unemployment, et cetera, probably all contributed to an increase in firearm violence.
The feeling that we are unsafe during the pandemic has driven an increase in gun sales from what people have been saying and studying. I mean, has that come back to us in terms of increased crime or increased, gun crime or firearm injuries?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's sort of a, at least theoretically, cyclical relationship between crime, violence, and access to guns, where people don't feel safe and they buy guns, and that can lead to more crime. So that makes, just empirically a challenge to study. In terms of this very specific question about whether the increase in gun access at the beginning of the pandemic had an impact on firearm violence, our team studied this, and we found sort of mixed findings. We found that there may have been some relationship with domestic violence, firearm-involved domestic violence, but the relationship with other types of firearm violence was less clear. And I think it could be that there was an association with the measures that we used, which importantly were background checks, which reflect legal sales. But it could also just be that there's a lot of things going on and it's difficult to disentangle statistically.
Right. Okay, we're running out of time. Again, there are two interesting questions, or actually a third one just came up. I wanted to go back to I think it was Al who mentioned the question of a new normal. What is a new normal? And Tom McMorrow of the Express News Group relates it back to something that Mayor Nutter said earlier in the previous panel, that the annual number of homicides actually began rising around 2016 or 2017. I think you can see that question in your box, Al. And Tom would like to know whether you have any thoughts about, whether that initial rise had any particular factors that drove it. This is obviously before the pandemic, and it wasn't rising at the pandemic rate.
There was certainly that rise that started before the pandemic hit us, and but that rise was relatively small, and it could well have been part of the fluctuations that we saw around the general decline in the post-2000 period. And so that could have been that there was generally a decline. And as that graph I showed indicated, in that 10-year graph, indicated a general dropping, but the rise was nothing like the 30% change that we saw in 2000. And that was a major factor, a major effect, and plus or minus 5% could have occurred for a whole variety of reasons that we've all been very much concerned with what gave rise to 30%. But again, the 30% had been much more of a stimulus to much concern and anxiety. And part of the issue I was trying to convey was that was a rise that would, when you see a small number, a 30% increase in that is troublesome, but it's nowhere near where we were back in the early 90s. And it's important that we recognize that we dealt with it then. And I'm confident that some of the attention that's being driven today is going to deal with some of that new normal as our society gets back to new normal, with a lot more people in the street. And so a lot of the crime that had been suppressed by the lockdown period will now start to show up because of the new normal of interactions and needs that show up, and much depends on some of the efforts that are targeted at addressing needs, and some of the issues that the president has posed, and to the extent that he can move some of those that might contribute to the new normal being less troublesome.
What's unfortunate is that isn't being reflected in the political rhetoric right now, and is certainly not going to be over the next 6 months. I'm thinking of the response, the Republican response to the President's State of the Union from the Iowa governor, who mentioned that violent crime, is now, quote, out of control, which is something, the kind of thing you would have seen in the 70s, which of course she said we are back to the 70s. And I don't know how you respond to that or what role the media has in responding to that.
Steve, we did see indications quite similar back in 15 and 16 after the Ferguson police killing and associated unrest across the country. Then President Trump made hay of the increase in homicide.
Carnage.
Yeah, exactly right. And so we've been in the same situation. Though the scale of the increase, as Al points out, was far smaller back in 15 and 16 than presently. But if the question is what gave rise to the earlier bump, the pre-pandemic bump, it coincided in time with the Ferguson incident, other incidents around the country, and associated street demonstrations across the country. Just as the more recent rise coincided in time with the mass social unrest after the George Floyd murder. The nature of the connection between the two is something that we have to still figure out.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions in our box, but I think I'm going to hold those. You can see them yourselves, but I'm going to send them to you separately, and to get answers, I'll send them around to our fellows, because we want to break off now for a 15-minute break, and then so we can start with our next panel after this. But I want to thank all of you for a wonderful and again really instructive panel. I think hopefully we've got to the bottom of some of the rhetoric. Not that it's going to insulate us against the rhetoric we're sure to see over the next 6 to 8 months. But again, thank you all for your time, and I hope you'll stay with us. So we'll take a 15-minute break now and come back about 12:30 or so Eastern.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you all.
you.